Now, our next speaker is not wearing a sari. He is a very senior and important thinker. Richard Damania, I'm going to introduce you to now. He's the chief economist of the World Bank. And when we asked him for his thoughts on how to deal with tensions in the transition and how to bridge these gaps between what people on the ground say they want and what policymakers are trying to achieve, he said we need to address the issue of subsidies for fossil fuels. They are enormous, many, many times bigger than the amount of money that goes into supporting clean energy production. And he said it could be done niftily, in an adroit fashion, which would actually deliver for the poor, create a set of poor pro policies. Let's hear from him now and see whether you're convinced. Richard Damania. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And let's see if I can live up to this. Ladies and gentlemen, a very, very good afternoon. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a report that we wrote with the title that you see on the screen. You can Google it if you're interested at all, Detox Development. And we're going to talk about something that's truly toxic in developing countries. And I'm going to suggest to you that we need to worry about developing countries because our problems, especially our environmental problems, are ones where we're interlinked. If we don't solve a lot of those problems in the developing world, we won't solve them in the rest of the world too, especially climate change, you know. And you know that everything that we have to do is going to cost enormous sums of money. But I'm going to show you where there's missing trillions, where you can find those missing trillions to pay for your circular economies and whatever else you want. And as the secret was just given away, those missing trillions are hidden in enormous subsidies given right across the world. Let me very quickly talk you through those. So let's talk about something called explicit subsidies. This is the amount of money that the government will hand over to you, either as a farmer or as a fossil fuel producer. So the subsidies to fossil fuels in terms of the handout is some way of the order of $500 billion. That's a lower bound. That's the lowest estimate you'll find. The other estimates are about $1 trillion. But never mind, let's not exaggerate. The number's big enough. Another $500 billion goes to farmers, and somewhat less goes to fisheries. Now, we could have spoken about all three subsidies given where we are, but this is an energy conference, so we'll only talk about the first. A lot of those subsidies do a lot of harm, and the figure that you see about the implicit subsidies are estimates from the literature of the harm that's done. We're going to talk a little bit about that. The subsidy that we're going to focus on is subsidies for fossil fuels, and they're ubiquitous. We find them in almost every country in the world. If you look at the magnitude of those subsidies, roughly $500 billion, so about $570 billion in fossil fuel subsidies. Remember, that's a lower bound. That is twice as much as the global subsidy that goes to renewable energy. And that is 5 times greater than the world's commitments for climate finance. There's something desperately wrong with the world in which we subsidize worsening climate change on the one hand, and on the other hand, we try to spend money to fix it. So any rational person will tell you, fix this problem first before you go into anything else. So let's dig a little bit deeper. Who are the biggest subsidizers? By the way, this is old data. It predates the war that we are seeing where things have changed. But the broad trends are what you see. If you produce a lot of oil, you tend to subsidize a lot of the oil. If you're a large economy, you also tend to have very heavy subsidies. And if you're more reliant, of course, you tend to subsidize it more. So if you produce it or you use it, you have very big subsidies, and if you have a large economy. A lot of those subsidies primarily cause worsening air pollution, something called PM 2.5, particulate matter 2.5. That's terrible. It's terrible because it kills, it's terrible because it causes morbidity, and it impacts growth. Let's delve into where the biggest impacts are. Roughly 4 million people a year die. That's again a lower bound. You get numbers up to 7 million if you go to some of the other publications that you have. So who's most affected? We divide the world up firstly into regions. It should come as no surprise that that large bar that you see on top is East Asia. And there's a lot of people in East Asia who are badly affected by pollution. If you look at the dark green or dark blue, whichever color you want to look at it, that's called hazardous levels of pollution. That is very bad. That's greater than 35 milligrams. So that's the stuff that really begins to shorten your life. The other stuff, the lighter green, that's not so bad, that's deemed to be unsafe, and almost no one is in that little portion that you actually have, which is safe, clean air. You're so fortunate over here. All the air that you have around here is probably the cleanest you could find anywhere in the globe. But once you leave the beautiful shores of Norway, that is really not the case that you see elsewhere in the world. The second thing I want you to take away from this graph is if you look at South Asia, which is the second bar, almost the entirety of South Asia suffers hazardous levels of pollution or worse. So let me give you a statistic. Hazardous is 35 micrograms. You can go to certain of the large cities, I won't mention any by name, and you're talking about 300, 500 on a regular basis, off the charts. Imagine what that's actually doing. Okay, top 10 countries, no surprises over here. China, India, United States is pretty bad as well, Indonesia, Pakistan. So that is what you would probably expect. But let's have another look. Let's focus, rather than looking at the number of people, let's focus on the proportion of people in each country who are exposed to hazardous pollution. And now we start seeing something which you probably might not have expected. Notice as you go to the middle of that graph, you're seeing small African countries. Who on earth thought that in Togo, in Ghana, and in Nigeria, the majority of the populations were suffering hazardous levels of air pollution? And you're going to see in the next graph too something quite similar. What we're observing for the first time in the developing cycle is that countries are suffering from pollution, high levels of pollution, at a much earlier stage of development than ever before. What used to happen in the past, I have a poor country, I start industrializing, like say China, I get huge amounts of pollution, then I go over the curve, as China has done, and the pollution declines. Nowadays, what you're seeing, much lower level of pollution, much lower level of development, countries are suffering pollution. Oh my God, is that the time? I should go fast. Look at that. Who thought Republic of Congo, right, would be top of the charts in terms of the poverty? Let's skip that one. Let's basically talk about this. So this gives you an indication of all the coal-fired power stations that we could find in the world. We modeled where the emissions come from and where they go. They're carried by the wind. And there you see a map of India, you see a map of China and parts of Eastern Europe over there. And what do we find? Roughly 1/3 of the world's population is downwind of a coal-fired power station, that's A. B, what you tend to find is that places downwind of a power station tends to be poorer, so you get more pollution where the people are poorer. Think of the climate justice, the environmental justice issue. That makes absolutely no sense. And of course, you know, this is indeed a big problem that we have. You've heard many people over today talking about whether we should tax fossil fuels. How effective would that be? We did a meta-analysis, so that's a deep survey, of all the studies we could find on the effectiveness of fuel price increases. 400 studies, 2,000 empirical estimates. And what we find is that the demand for fossil fuel prices is very inelastic. That is, if I increase the price, demand usage falls very, very little. So you need complementary instruments. It's not going to work as we go so far. Okay, let me go to my last slide now. I've got 3 seconds left. Subsidy reform is enormously, enormously difficult. It's very difficult because the benefits are not always visible. When I remove a subsidy, suddenly the price of gasoline goes up, but the fact that I end up with cleaner air, that's not always so obvious, and that's going to take a lot of time. And the other reason why the reform is so difficult, of course, is you're fighting vested interests. If I take away a subsidy from a farmer, we know the farmer is going to feel bad and scream and shout and yell and jump up and down, but the people, the general taxpayer who benefits from it, well, those benefits are highly diffused. So there's an asymmetry in the lobbying which renders this quite difficult. I've gone into deficit time and I shouldn't go into deficit, so let me stop over here. Thank you so much.